In 1955, a 14-year-old boy traveled from Chicago to Mississippi to spend the summer with family. He laughed easily. He talked freely. He didn't know there were rules he wasn't supposed to break. A few days later, he would be taken from his bed in the middle of the night, not by police, not by the law, but by men who believed the law was on their side. What happened to Emmett Till was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a crime fueled by hate and protected by silence. His murder would shock the nation. It would expose the truth about justice in America. And it would force the world to see what racism looks like when it is allowed to rule. This is the story of Emmett Till and the crime that changed America forever. Before Emmett Till became a headline, before his name became history, he was just a boy. Emmett Lewis Till was born in Chicago in 1941. He was 14 years old in the summer of 1955. He was known for his laughter, for joking too much, for being confident in rooms where other kids stayed quiet. Friends and family remembered him as playful, sometimes mischievous, but warm, the kind of child who smiled easily, the kind of child who wasn't afraid to speak. Emmett was raised by his mother, Mamie Till. She was strict, protective, and deeply proud of her son. She taught him to be respectful, to hold his head high, to believe he mattered. In Chicago, Emmett lived a different life than the one waiting for him in Mississippi. He went to school with white children. He moved freely. He spoke freely. He didn't grow up under Jim Crow the way Southern black children did. He didn't learn fear as a survival skill, and that difference would matter. When Emmett prepared to visit relatives in Mississippi that summer, his family warned him. Not gently, not casually. They told him the South was different. They told him there were rules, rules no one wrote down, rules that changed how you walked, how you talked, how you looked at white people, rules that could get you killed. Mamie Till warned her son to be careful, to be respectful, to remember where he was. Emmett listened. But he didn't fully understand. Because how could he? He was 14 years old, and no one should have to learn fear that way. Emmett Till did not travel to Mississippi looking for trouble. He went there for a summer, for family, for memories. What he found instead was a system that had already decided his fate, and in August of 1955, Emmett Till stepped into a place where being a child was no protection at all. In the summer of 1955, Emmett Till left Chicago and traveled south to Mississippi, not for adventure, not for defiance, but to visit family. The journey itself marked a crossing, not just of distance, but of reality, from the north to the deep south. In Chicago, Emmett moved through the world as a child. In Mississippi, he would be seen as something else entirely. The Mississippi Delta was governed by rules that were never written down, but always enforced. Rules shaped by fear, rules shaped by violence, rules shaped by race. Black families in the South lived under constant awareness of those rules. They knew when to look away. They knew when to stay silent. They knew which lines could never be crossed. And before Emmett arrived, his relatives tried to prepare him. They warned him not to speak too boldly, not to joke with white people, not to draw attention to himself. They told him that in Mississippi, confidence could be mistaken for disrespect, and disrespect could be punished. Emmett listened, but the world he was entering was foreign to him, because fear had never been part of his daily life. He stayed with his great-uncle, Moses Wright, in a small rural community. Life there moved slowly. The air was heavy. Everyone watched everything. Neighbors noticed newcomers. People talked. Whispers traveled fast. Emmett stood out, not because he tried to, but because he didn't know how not to. He laughed loudly. He joked easily. He spoke the way he always had. And in Mississippi, that was enough. In the days after his arrival, nothing seemed out of place. Emmett worked in the fields. He spent time with cousins. He adjusted as best as he could. But beneath the surface, the danger was already there. Waiting, silent. Because in a system built on racial control, it didn't take violence to start a tragedy. It only took an accusation. And that accusation would come from a small grocery store on a quiet afternoon in the heart of Mississippi. On August 24, 1955, Emmett Till went with his cousins to a small grocery store in Money, Mississippi. The store was modest, quiet, unremarkable. It was owned by a white couple. Inside that store was a woman named Carolyn Bryant. What happened next would be reduced to a single accusation, an accusation that would cost a 14-year-old boy his life. According to accounts, Emmett may have spoken to Carolyn Bryant. Some said he whistled. Others said he said something playful. Some later claimed nothing happened at all. There were no witnesses who agreed on what took place. There was no physical evidence. There was no crime. Only a claim. In the Mississippi of 1955, that was enough. A black boy accused of offending a white woman did not need proof attached to his name. The accusation itself carried weight, deadly weight. When Emmett left the store, he didn't run, he didn't hide, he didn't believe he was in danger, because to him, nothing serious had happened. But outside that store, the rules were different, and the consequences were already forming. Word spread quickly through the small community. Whispers turned into certainty. Assumptions hardened into judgment. And judgment, in that place and time, did not belong to the courts. It belonged to those who believed they had the right to enforce the rules themselves. Emmett Till returned to his relative's home that night, unaware that his name was already being spoken with anger. Unaware that the accusation had traveled faster than the truth ever could. Unaware that the decision had already been made. Just days later, that accusation would bring a knock on the door in the middle of the night. In the early hours of August 28, 1955, the night was quiet in Money, Mississippi. Most of the town was asleep. Inside a small house, Emmett Till was in bed, 14 years old, unarmed, unaware. Then came the sound that would change everything, a knock on the door. Not loud, not urgent, but deliberate. Moses Wright, Emmett's great-uncle, opened the door to find two white men standing outside. They were armed. They were calm. And they had come for Emmett. They said they wanted the boy who had been accused of offending a white woman. They did not show a warrant. They did not identify themselves as law enforcement. But in Mississippi in 1955, they didn't need to. Inside the house, fear spread quickly. Family members pleaded. They begged. They offered money. Moses Wright asked if they could take Emmett away, just to talk to him, and then bring him back. The men agreed. It was a lie. Emmett was pulled from his bed and forced to get dressed. He was scared, but he still believed the adults around him would protect him. As he was led outside, he called out to his uncle. Moses Wright watched helplessly as his nephew was taken into the darkness. He would never see Emmett alive again. The truck drove away, the dust settled, and the house went quiet. In that silence, everyone understood what had just happened, even if no one dared say it out loud, because in that moment Emmett Till had been removed from the protection of family and delivered into a system where hate did not hide. What happened next would remain hidden for days, until the river gave up its secret. What happened to Emmett Till after he was taken from his uncle's home was not witnessed by a crowd. There were no cameras, no recordings, only the certainty that he was never meant to return. Emmett was driven away from Money, Mississippi, far from familiar roads, far from anyone who could help him. He was 14 years old. The men who took him believed they were enforcing a rule, a rule that placed his life beneath their authority. Emmett was beaten, not in a moment of rage, but deliberately. This was not chaos. It was control. At some point, Emmett was shot. His life ended in a place where the law did not intervene and where mercy was never offered. But even death was not enough. His body was weighted down and thrown into the Tallahatchie River, as if to erase him, as if to make him disappear. In Mississippi, this was not an unusual ending for black victims of racial violence. Many bodies were never found. Many names were never spoken again, but Emmett Till would not vanish. Days passed. His family waited. They hoped. And then the river surfaced the truth. What had been done in darkness was about to be seen in the light. When Emmett Till's body was recovered from the river, the world would be forced to confront what hate had done. 3 days after Emmett Till was taken, a body surfaced in the Tallahatchie River. It was badly damaged. So damaged that at first identification was uncertain, but there were two things that made it unmistakable: a ring and a mother's certainty. The ring had belonged to Emmett's father. It was something Emmett always wore. Something small, something personal. When Mamie Till was informed, she insisted on seeing her son. Authorities warned her not to. They told her it would be too painful. They told her it would be better to remember him as he was. She refused. Mamie Till identified her son, not because she wanted to relive the horror, but because she wanted the truth acknowledged. She wanted the world to know what had been done to her child. Emmett's body was returned to Chicago in a sealed casket. Officials urged Mamie Till to keep it closed. Again, she refused. She made a decision that would change history. She demanded an open casket funeral. When asked why, she gave a simple reason: let the people see what I've seen. Thousands of mourners came. Photographs were published. The images spread across the country. For the first time, America was forced to confront the face of racial violence, not as rumor, not as statistics, but as a child. Emmett Till's body was laid to rest, but his story was only beginning. Because once the world had seen what hate could do, the question became whether justice would follow. The trial for the murder of Emmett Till began in September of 1955. It took place in Sumner, Mississippi. From the start, the outcome felt predetermined. The courtroom was segregated. The jury was all white. All male. Emmett Till's killers sat confidently at the defense table. They joked. They smiled. They were not afraid. For the prosecution, the case was simple. A child had been taken from his home. His body had been recovered from a river. Witnesses could place the men at the scene. Moses Wright, Emmett's great-uncle, took the stand. In a courtroom filled with white faces, in the Deep South of 1955, Moses Wright stood up and pointed directly at the men who had taken his nephew. It was an act of extraordinary courage. He named them. The room went silent, but courage was not enough. The defense attacked witnesses. They questioned credibility. They relied on the unspoken understanding that a black man's word did not outweigh a white man's denial. Carolyn Bryant testified. Her story shifted. Details changed. But the jury did not question her. After just over an hour of deliberation, the verdict was announced. Not guilty. One juror later admitted they would have reached a verdict faster if they hadn't stopped to drink soda. Emmett Till's murderers walked free. The courtroom emptied. The case was closed. And justice once again had chosen not to act. But the story did not end with the verdict, because the truth would eventually be spoken, without fear of consequence. With the verdict delivered, the case was officially over. Under American law, the men acquitted of Emmett Till's murder could never be tried again. Double jeopardy protected them. The system that had failed to stop the crime now guaranteed there would be no punishment. Months later, the truth emerged, not in a courtroom, but in the pages of a magazine. In January of 1956, the men who had been acquitted sold their story to Look magazine. For money. They confessed. They described taking Emmett Till from his home. They described beating him. They described killing him. They spoke without fear, without remorse, because they knew they were untouchable. The confession shocked the nation, but it changed nothing legally. No arrests were made, no charges were filed. The law had already decided whose lives were protected and whose were disposable. For Black Americans, the message was clear. You could be murdered in public view, your killers could confess, and still walk free. Emmett Till's death was no longer just a tragedy. It was proof. Proof that racism was not only personal, it was institutional. But while the justice system closed its doors, Emmett Till's mother refused to let his story fade. After the trial ended, many expected Mamie Till to disappear into grief, to retreat, to mourn in private. Instead, she chose something far more dangerous. She chose to speak. Mamie Till refused to let her son's death be reduced to a footnote or buried beneath legal language and courtroom excuses. She began traveling. She spoke in churches, community halls, and schools. She told Emmett's story again and again, not to relive the pain, but to force the nation to remember. She did not describe hate with anger. She described it with clarity. Mamie Till understood something powerful. That silence was exactly what the system depended on, and she denied it. Wherever she went, she reminded people that Emmett Till was a child, that he had a mother, that he had a future. Her strength transformed private grief into public resistance. Mamie Till did not seek revenge. She sought truth. And in doing so, she gave a voice to countless families whose stories had never been heard, families whose losses had been dismissed, ignored, or erased. Through her courage, Emmett Till became more than a victim. He became a symbol of what happens when hate is allowed to rule unchecked. And as Mamie Till carried her son's story across the country, its impact began to ripple far beyond Mississippi. The murder of Emmett Till did not fade quietly into history. It spread. The photographs from his open casket funeral were seen across the country, in newspapers, magazines, and living rooms. For many Americans, this was the first time racial violence was impossible to ignore. The images stripped away denial. They forced a confrontation with reality. Emmett Till's death became a turning point. Just months later, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a city bus. When asked why, she later said she thought of Emmett Till. His name echoed through the growing civil rights movement. In protests, in speeches, in songs, and in silence, activists no longer spoke only in abstract terms about injustice. They spoke about a 14-year-old boy. Lawmakers were pressured, journalists investigated, communities organized. Emmett Till's murder exposed a truth many had tried to deny, that racism was not a regional problem. It was a national one. While justice never came for Emmett Till in a courtroom, his story helped reshape public conscience. It helped fuel demands for civil rights legislation. It helped galvanize a generation. His life was stolen, but his legacy forced a reckoning. And yet, even with all that change, the question remains, what does justice look like when it comes too late? Emmett Till was 14 years old. A child. He did not understand the rules that governed Mississippi in 1955. Rules built on fear, silence, and violence. He did not know that an accusation could outweigh his life, that justice could be denied so easily. that the truth could be seen and still ignored. What happened to Emmett Till was not an isolated crime. It was a reflection of a system that decided whose lives mattered and whose did not. Pause. His killers were never punished, but his story refused to stay buried, because sometimes justice does not arrive through courts or verdicts. Sometimes it arrives through memory, through mothers who refuse silence, through stories that demand to be told, through people who choose to look at the truth, even when it is uncomfortable. Emmett Till's life was taken, but his name became a warning and a call, a reminder of what hate can do when it is protected. This was the crime of hate that changed America.